How do we Christians navigate life in the world with our loyalty to Christ on the one hand and our loyalties to the many things in the world we value? Can we be faithful Christians and still participate in the culture around us? Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, August 7th, 2025. In the winter of 1949, a theologian named H. Richard Niebuhr gave a series of lectures at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary that then formed the basis of a book he published 2 years later in 1951 called Christ and Culture. Not to be confused with his somewhat more famous brother Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr was for 31 years a professor at Yale Divinity School, teaching theology and Christian ethics. In his lectures and in his book, Niebuhr opens up a central polarity that has been part of the Christian experience literally from the very beginning of the church. It is the polarity we all experience in one form or another as a tension between our loyalty to Jesus Christ on the one hand and the way we relate to the world in which we live on the other. This is not exactly the same thing as the church-state issues we struggle with, but those are part of this issue. Niebuhr's main idea is that baked into Christian faith is a tension between loyalty to Jesus Christ and loyalty to the many objects and institutions that together make up the culture in which we live. His particular genius, though, was not simply to recognize this tension, but rather to describe several ways the church has typically sought to resolve the tension between the two. His shorthand for this problem as a whole is Christ and culture. So, for the next several days, I'm going to look at the 5 typical ways Niebuhr sees the church throughout the ages as having dealt with this question, all the way from the church renouncing culture on the one hand to church completely embracing culture on the other, and several ways in between. As I dive into this series, I need to say a few words about how Niebuhr's work has been received and why it continues to inform my work, my preaching, my teaching. The first thing to say is that Niebuhr's book, Christ and Culture, has remained in print continually since it was first published in 1951. Very few works of Christian theology can make that claim. Some, but not very many. He has not been without his critics, of course, but even his critics have had to deal with this work and take it seriously. You can't simply ignore it. It is an enduring classic of Christian thought. A second thing to say, and this is partly autobiographical, is that I have a special affinity for Niebuhr. My doctoral dissertation advisor wrote his dissertation on H. Richard Niebuhr, including an important chapter on Christ and culture. His dissertation advisor, in turn, a man named James Gustafson, did his dissertation under, you guessed it, H. Richard Niebuhr. So, in a sense, I am in the Niebuhr theology family tree, as it were. But my affinity for Niebuhr goes beyond this rather strained personal connection. Perhaps more than any other theologian, I orient myself through his work, and you are either the beneficiaries or the victims of this orientation on my part. Finally, what Niebuhr explicitly tries to do is describe 5 typical answers to the question of Christ and culture, the question of how Christians live in and relate to the world as disciples of Jesus Christ. He calls these 5 ways typical because he traces them through the history of the church, from the writers of various books of the New Testament to the early church fathers, to important theologians throughout the history of the church and into the modern world. He writes, "It is helpful to remember that the question of Christianity and civilization is by no means a new one, that Christian perplexity in this area has been perennial, and that the problem has been an enduring one through all the Christian centuries. It is helpful also to recall that the repeated struggles of Christians with this problem have yielded no single Christian answer, but only a series of typical answers, which together, for faith, represent phases of the strategy of the militant church in the world. That strategy, however, being in the mind of the captain rather than the lieutenants, is not under control of the latter. So over the next few days, I want to walk through these 5 typical answers, appreciating each for what it brings to the table, but ultimately landing pretty much where Niebuhr himself lands. As we walk through this journey together, be thinking about your own questions, your own struggles with this tension between Christ and culture, between living a life of faith and living in the world. Then, as I walk us through each of the typical ways, see where you find yourself fitting in. One last thing. There is no one right answer here, and Niebuhr would be the first to say that. While he has a clear preference for one of the typical answers, he is very clear that faithful Christians have gravitated toward each one of them. My hope is to stimulate your thinking about your own sense of discipleship in a broken and hurting world. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.